30 years ago tonight, my cousin's son, Neil Aggett, was in a narrow cell in solitary confinement in Pretoria Central Prison. He was 28. He was a medical doctor who worked the night shift over weekends at Baragwanath's in the accident and emergency department, in order that for the rest of the week he could work as an unpaid trade unionist. Now, if we rolled back 18 years earlier, both my brother and I had been in detention in Pretoria Central Prison. And after my brother was sentenced, he got to know Pretoria Central Prison pretty well, because he was there then for a further 2 years. While I came to England, I didn't actually flee. I was given a passport, but after a while it was taken away from me. So in effect, my staying in England became exile. Now, when Neil was arrested in November of 1981, just over 30 years ago, I didn't know about it. My parents used to write weekly letters, and there was no mention of this in any of their letters. You see, silence was the norm at that time, and there were certain conversations that were like minefields. Well, after 2 weeks in Pretoria Central, Neil was transferred into Section 6 of the Terrorism Act, and he was transferred physically to this place. Now, this is John Vorster Square. It's Johannesburg's police headquarters, named after the notorious Prime Minister Balthazar John Vorster. Some of you might even remember how he used to look with his glasses, very heavy-rimmed glasses. I seem to think that those the windows there with their concrete frames remind me of kind of his glasses stacked one upon the other, spying upon Johannesburg. And he'd actually been the Minister of Justice when we had been sent to detention. He brought in 90 days detention law. Now, the 9th and 10th floor of John Vorster Square were devoted entirely to the security police. And they were sealed off, as it were, from the rest of the building by kind of a panoply of grills, electronic doors, and locks. And the security police were known to joke with some detainees that they called this place Timol Heights. Their story was that the young teacher, Ahmed Timol, had slipped past his interrogators and thrown himself out of a 10th floor window to his death. Well, on the 5th of February, 1982, the news was announced that a detainee, Neil Aggett, had been found hanging from the grille of his cell door. And I heard the news over Radio 4. I rang my mom, and yes, it was my cousin's son. Well, at least 50 black detainees had died before then, and Neil was the first white detainee. Neil had been born in Kenya at the height of Mau Mau resistance to British colonialism. My novel, Burn My Heart, is set in the years just before he was born, reflecting all the tension and the fears of that time. His mom, a librarian who was rather older than me, had married a Kenyan settler during World War II and had gone up north. Neil was their third child, and this is his mom's favorite photo. It shows Neil, the little Bwana, the Bwana Gidogo, with one of his dad's workers, the farm mechanic. And in those 28 years, he made an extraordinary journey from being this little Bwana Gidogo to this young man who had become a very dedicated, seasoned trade union organizer, who was absolutely felt himself accountable to the workers whom he believed that he needed to serve. And what had happened, and on the right there, this is at his funeral, when something like 15,000 workers, mainly workers, comrades, workers, had come onto the streets of Joburg and physically carried his coffin all the way from St. Mary's Cathedral, which had been packed, all the way to the whites-only cemetery of West Park Cemetery, and they laid him to rest there. And Bishop Tutu at the time said it was an incredible demonstration of affection by, for a young white man by thousands of blacks. And he said, you know, we only give this funeral to really special people. And Neil, in fact, they were affirming as a son of the soil. Well, as a medical student, Neil had begun to realize that apartheid was a disease that couldn't be cured by medicine alone. And as he began to transform himself, he began to get into a confrontation with his dad, and a huge rift developed between him and his dad, who had brought the family down to apartheid South Africa when Kenya had become independent. But as this rift developed, Neil still tried to keep in touch with his mom, and I want to read you this letter, part of this letter, that he wrote to her when by now he was an intern and he was in Umtata in the Eastern Cape. And he started, the date of the letter is interesting. It's the 15th of June, 1977. It was the eve of the first anniversary of the Soweto uprising. Dear Mom, just a short note to thank you for your letter and to let you know that things are going well here. It's very cold, with frost on the grass most mornings and 6 blankets at night. But the days are warm and dry. I'm living in the doctor's quarters, and in the evening we cook our food together in the kitchen. Papa and Ngusha usually. And then he goes on to tell her how he goes out to the mission hospital and what he does at weekends. And then he shifts tack, having said that he hopes she's all well at home and that the other, you know, his brother and sister are fine. And he says, I am sorry for you that I have split from the family, but there are basic contradictions that neither of us could live with. I am always grateful for the love and care that you gave me as a child. But at some point, I had to evaluate the world from an independent perspective and make my own decisions. I'm sorry for all the hurt I have caused you, but I'm sure you realize that I am not standing against you or the family in particular, but against the whole social order. And here are his parents at the grave on the day of the funeral, surrounded by banners and singing, and they were thrown into a huge journey, especially his father. You know, the state they had trusted had destroyed their son. And they were thrown into a world that they didn't know at all, that they'd never acknowledged before. And letters, in this immediate aftermath of the announcement of the death, letters began to flood in. And so, for instance, let me read you the letter that came from Ahmed Timol's mother. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Aggett and family, my deepest sympathies on the loss of your son, Neil. I can imagine how you must be feeling, because I felt the same when I lost my son, also while in detention, and also the same age. Please be brave. God is great, and may he rest his soul in peace. And then there was a letter from someone I don't think they'd have recognized her name. It was Victoria Mklenga. Her husband had been brutally murdered just a few weeks earlier by what was believed at the time to be apartheid forces, and now we know, who murdered him and how through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And she was to be assassinated 2 years later. She was an attorney like her husband. And she wrote about her, I'm singularly ill-equipped to comfort you, but rest assured that I share your grief and sorrow. And later on she goes to say, he was a gentle and humane person. He was the kind of man whose death makes the rest of us feel that in some way we have lost part of ourselves. And I think that they were suddenly exposed to a very deep humanity that must have helped them deal with this completely untoward situation they found themselves in. And most of all, they wanted the truth. They wanted to know what had happened inside John Forster Square. And, instinctively, they felt that the police had murdered him and that, that it had been torture and something had happened in the torture. And however, and I should say that Neil's father was prepared to use all his savings to buy the best lawyers. And George Bezos, who had been Nelson Mandela's lawyer, agreed to lead the family's team at the inquest. And the lawyers then persuaded the family not to try and go for that, to prove. They said, you're not going to be able to prove this. There are no witnesses. But let us say, okay, so he committed suicide. Why? Why? We will go for induced suicide. And we will want to know what it is that made a healthy young man like Neil commit suicide. And what they wanted to do was then to bring in other detainees and to push the magistrate to allow other detainees to come in and give their evidence as to what was actually happening inside John Forster Square. Well, it was a very difficult decision, but the Aggetts took it, and they agreed. And that way. There we are. Okay, the week after, the day after Neil's death, there was a very active detainee parent support committee, and they had pressured the security police to allow a very brief visit for each for each family who had someone who was being detained. And in the course of that visit, one Morris Smithers, a fellow detainee of Neil's, smuggled out a tiny note, 3 centimeters by 10 centimeters, rolled up inside the false bottom of a matchbox, and he smuggled it to his sister. And it said, be very, very careful with this. Well, what this note was an account of was having seen Neil 10 days earlier behind frosted glass in an interrogation room, Neil seeming to be naked and being beaten and being forced to do very, very, very strenuous exercises, physical exercises. And Morris's sister got the note to the family's lawyers and then drove down to Durban, to Cape Town, and she got it to Helen Suzman, the one MP, the opposition MP, who was, brave enough to take this up. And Helen Suzman went into the House of Parliament and she read the note without, of course, saying who the detainee was, from whom she'd got it, and she withheld Neil's name till the very end of the note. And when she revealed who this was about, there was uproar. She was told this was out of order, this whole thing is sub judice. And what she had done is she had given this note to a very trusted editor friend. And that afternoon, the editor had published the note. And so by the time the whole thing was declared sub judice, the note was out, and the evidence was out, and it was in the papers. And, it was the tip of the iceberg. And the lawyers did manage to get quite a number of detainees to come and give evidence at the inquest. But, as predicted, no one to blame, as in the Biko inquest. Nevertheless, this inquest broke ground. It broke ground in the fact of bringing these detainees for the very first time in a court of law, actually saying what was going on inside John Forster Square. And I want to show you this, because this is one of my favorite pictures of Neil. It's of the vegetable gardeners. Here he's with his friend Gavin Anderson and his partner Liz Floyd, who was detained with him. And these were a group of internal activists, terribly idealistic, but very much believing that they needed to be democratically accountable. And this is an issue that's playing itself out in South Africa now. Amnesty had sent an observer to this inquest in the final stages, and very rightly said that, yes, suicide maybe, but he'd been broken by the system. And this remarkable letter that I actually found in the family's papers quite recently, on Amnesty International, from an Amnesty International, the research department, sending it to a Mr. D. Futterman, a Mr. David Futterman actually, at a very solid solicitor's firm, Carruthers and Company, might seem innocuous enough. It was passing on the heads of argument that the lawyers were arguing in the inquest. This is November 82, at the end, towards the end of the inquest. But what Amnesty probably didn't know was that actually David Futterman and Carruthers and Co. were part of an extraordinary secret network that had been set up by Canon Collins of St. Paul's Cathedral, that got in millions of pounds into South Africa secretly for the defense of political prisoners and for the welfare of their families. The welfare of their families involved something at one point, 700 people, ordinary people across the United Kingdom, writing and sending money into political families in South Africa. And, you know, Canon Collins believed in the power of individuals to make a difference. Come on. Next one. Be good to me. There we are. Martin Ennals, Amnesty International's first Secretary General. And I owe him personal thanks because he became the Secretary General in 1968, but in 1966, he helped a one Nandagopal Naidoo, who was stranded as a refugee in Bechuanaland, becoming Botswana. He'd been stranded there for about a year. And he helped him gain entry into Britain without a passport. 2 years later, we met and married. So for that alone, I have to thank Amnesty International's drive and spirit. And, and finally, you know, South African apartheid was not unique in its brutality and cruelty. For over 2,500 years, Aesop's fables have served as a reminder of our animal natures. Here in The Lion and the Warthog, that you probably know as The Lion and the Boar, but Piet Grobler, the artist, and I have reset this in South Africa. And here, these two creatures are going tusk and teeth over who is going to drink at the waterhole, until they look up and they see the vultures, and they decide it's safer to be friends than enemies. Well, witty, wise Aesop, whom I believe was North African, was ever the realist. So what makes us different from our animal brothers and sisters? I propose that it is the idealists who remind us about what is uniquely human. People like Canon Collins, Martin Ennals, and the young man who wrote to his mother that he is standing up against the whole social order. Without conscience and without ideals, what are we? Thank you.